Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for attending this interview with Professor Stan de Haan, which we are very honored to have here with us today. So, hello, Stan, and welcome to this interview.
Hello, Davide.
So, Professor Stan de Haan is professor at Collège de France in Paris, and is one of the most renowned neuroscientists in the world. His interest issues going from numerical cognition to consciousness to reading, of course, which is what we will talk about today mostly. Am I right, Stan? Am I missing anything on your background and interests?
I have a lot of interest. I became the director of the Neurospin facility here in France, where we do a lot of brain imaging. And of course, we study virtually all aspects of the human brain. I'm especially interested in what happens in the human brain that does not happen in the brains of other primates.
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic. We will try to touch upon that. And of course, we would be super glad to know about the latest research that is going on there in your new center. All right, so okay, let's jump into the action and talk about reading. Sorry, I also forgot to introduce myself, which I was asked to do. So I'm Davide Crepaldi. I'm an associate professor in cognitive neuroscience in SISA in Trieste, which actually creates a nice connection with Stan himself, because I'm essentially here in the workplace where Stan PhD mentor Jacques Meller ended his career. So I'm very honored that I had the chance to be in the same department as Jacques for only a few months, unfortunately. All right, so we were talking about reading. So let's start from the definition of the object of study, right? So and at the very center of your reflections of reading, Stan, there's always been this idea that reading is a cultural object, right? What do you mean by that? Why do you think this is a cultural object differently from maybe other domain of cognition?
Well, yes, it's very important to understand that there's a huge difference between written language versus spoken language. Written language is an invention that some cultures have created actually very recently, just about 3,000 years ago, a little less actually for the alphabet. It's something that was not planned, if I may say, or was not anticipated by evolution. Probably for spoken language, there has been a specific evolution. We see that the respiratory tract has changed. We see that probably the spoken language system is inscribed in the brain in a deep way in infants. We could talk about the research in infants. But it seems that there is what Noam Chomsky was calling a language acquisition device for spoken language. But that's not the case for written language. Written language is something that we created out of the blue. Until recently, there were very few people who could read. So my argument is that there cannot have been a sort of selective pressure for a genetic basis of reading. And we have to tinker with the brain resources that we have from our primate evolution. So this is an idea that I've developed under the name of neuronal recycling. We need to make use of whatever circuits we have in the visual system, in the auditory system, in the language system, and we manage to rewire the brain in a part in order to acquire a novel ability, which is reading. We recycle existing circuits.
That's a very interesting idea, I think, this idea that we can recycle resources that biology has endowed us with to other purposes. There's many other examples, well, maybe not many, but I'm sure there's several other examples of that, right? Of tools that our cognitive system is now very used to manage that came out more or less in the same way, right? As inventions that humankind has essentially devised themselves.
I think it's a frequent idea in the domain of human abilities. Whenever there is a cultural invention, we create something new, but it needs to find a particular niche in the brain. So, for instance, when we created Arabic numerals, it's also a very recent evolution, even more recent than the alphabet. It's so useful, right, to manipulate numbers in the Arabic or Indo-Arabic notation, the usual numbers from 0 to 9 and the positional notation. Well, that's something that we can see as encroached on very old circuits in the parietal cortex that are involved in quantity processing. So that was the topic of my previous book, The Number Sense. We start with a number sense that is given to us by evolution. In fact, we share it with so many other primate species and also non-human primates, but also other animals, including very different animals from us, like corvids, for instance. Birds, have a number sense. So this is something that is available from evolution, but what was not available is the symbols for Arabic numerals. We managed to recycle the circuits for quantity processing in a circuit that is able to do exact calculation. I could give you many other examples. One we are studying in the lab at the moment, we're just starting to study, is the ability to understand mathematical graphs. It's a beautiful invention where you recycle your occipital cortex, which has this remarkable visual ability, and you use it to process, let's say, 1,000 numbers in the form of a graph, because the data is plotted in a particular way. If you had to process 1,000 numbers, that would be terrible, incredibly slow. But because you're using this chip in the part of your occipital cortex, you can do it extremely fast, and in 1 second or less, you can perceive the trend in data and say, oh, there is an outlier and it's going down and so on. You can see the shape of a mathematical function. This is all possible because we're recycling our visual system for mathematics. So I'm extremely interested in how humans use learning on top of an innate architecture, innate circuitry, in order to achieve a higher level of cultural development. And this is something which is quite particular to humans. There are no other animals that really have this additional layer of culture in the same way that we do.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I think we may come back later in the interview to this idea of cultural evolution or cultural acquisition, taking advantage of some other recent work that I became aware of that I think is very provocative in this sense, more from the philosophical work, which I think is very interesting. It's very challenging for us neuroscientists, which very easily tend to forget. At least I'm talking for myself, of course. This very much thinking that has been going around for several thousand years before we started studying these things experimentally. But before going into that, I would like to come back to this idea of recycling, right? Because for non-neuroscientists, this may be a little bit of a mystery. What do you mean exactly? Do you mean that essentially you have the circuitry that is working perfectly in one domain and you just take it as is to another domain? Or it is rather the case that there are some twitches and little changes that has to happen into this cognitive machinery? And if so, what happens to the previous domain, which is, I think it's another big mystery and another show off of our incredible ability as learners, right? I have a young daughter who's now 8 years old, so she's starting to take up reading. And one amazing fact that I was noticing in her as she was started having to deal with letters is these things that she kept confounding vertically symmetrical letters in particular, right? So for example, lowercase p and lowercase q are still very difficult to her up to now. How is that? Is that connected to this idea of recycling?
Yeah, absolutely. We've used this example a lot in our research. So I've been studying these questions basically by scanning the brains of people before and after the acquisition of reading, or people who have learned to read versus people who have not learned to read. So comparing the literate brain to the illiterate brain. And we can do that in adults. We found some adults in Brazil, in Portugal, who simply didn't go to school and never learned to read. Or we can do that in children. We can scan children before and after they learn to read, or at about the same age. Some have learned to read, some have not. So we've done all of these experiments with fMRI. And the first thing that we find is that in people who have learned to read, in all of us, you and I, there is a little area of the ventral visual pathway which gets specialized for reading. Now we scan it with the more modern scanners at 7 Tesla. We can see it's super specific. There are little patches of cortex that will respond only to letters, and not just any letters, but the letters you know. If I show you, I don't know, Hebrew letters or Chinese characters, they will not respond if you don't know these languages, but they will respond if you've learned them. So it's clearly an effect of learning. So I think that's the response to your question. There is some tuning going on. We use a circuit that already exists. It's a circuit that does visual recognition for other categories like objects or faces. But this circuit needs to be adapted to the specific characters that we are going to use. And if it's Roman letters, there is going to be some patches of cortex that are going to specialize for these functions. And the second part of your question is also yes. When we specialize these areas of cortex, we change a little bit the function of the system, the organization of the system. One of the main things that we've seen is a little competition with the face system. It's so interesting. Normally, there is a specialization for faces, and it's been well known that it's right lateralized in the right hemisphere, whereas the reading system is more in the left hemisphere. Well, what we found is that this depends a little bit on being literate or illiterate. If you're illiterate, you have a more bilateral face system. But if you learn to read, the space which is taken in the left hemisphere by the reading system means that there's a little bit of pushing of the face system towards the right hemisphere. There's a sort of competition between these two domains. And so the better a reader you are, the more right lateralization you have for the face system. That's already a form of cortical competition, and I take it as a sort of proof of this idea of recycling. The space in the cortex is not infinite. You need to make space for the new function. And then there is what you mentioned, this incredible case of mirror errors. Initially, people thought that this was dyslexia. Children who would confuse P's and Q's, they would be called dyslexic. That's not the case. We know it's not the case now. We know it's a function of the cortex before the acquisition of reading. We all have a visual system that, for instance, recognizes that this is a hand, but this is also a hand. So it does mirror symmetry recognition. It recognizes objects regardless of whether they're seen from the left or they're seen from the right. And it's very important because it's an invariance that essentially allows us to have better object recognition. But suddenly you learn to read, and that's not useful anymore because we have these awful letters like B's and D's. They're actually completely different letters, although they are mirror symmetrical. So what we have found is that you need to unlearn the symmetry. And it takes time. And it's a sort of obstacle to reading acquisition. Some children find it more difficult than others to accept that B and D is actually a different object. When I worked with illiterate subjects, it was amazing. Some adult people, they look at a B and a D and they say, no, it's the same. It's exactly the same. So I show them on the transparency, I slide it like this, and they say, no, it's different. I slide it again, and they say, no, it's the same. They cannot see it. Their visual system is wired to see the same shape when it's a B and a D because it's mirror symmetrical. So we unlearn that when we learn to read. It's a property of the system that we have to leave aside for the reading system. And what we've found is that there's a little bit of a cost. When you've learned to read, you become slightly worse at recognizing mirror images and saying this is the same object. So you lose a little bit, and once again, I take it as a proof that there is competition in the cortex when you learn to read. So proof of cortical recycling.
Yeah, when you were talking, it came up to my mind this that there's another pretty big field in neuroscience where they talk a lot about recycling, but I think in a very, very different way. And this brings us to an interesting point, I would say, which is the case of people that have a very different perceptual experience of the world from us. Think about blind, right? The people that study blind brains always talk about recycling what would be in us, normally seeing people, visual areas into something else. But there's this idea in that literature that this potential for recycling is not infinite. You cannot bring there any cognitive function, right? There are constraints. So our brain is actually more than the brain as a whole. Brain circuits, the small scale brain circuits, are wired in a way that would allow them to process this type of information, to do this type of task, but not this other type of task. So I guess that maybe the same idea would apply to the reading case, right? So the alphabet that we have that appear to us as somewhat arbitrary, right? We could decide between me and you right now that the alphabet looks completely different, and that's fine. It sounds like a social convention, but maybe it's actually not. In order for the brain to be able to do all what you said essentially effectively, there are constraints. So the letters have to look in a specific way, have to look in a way our brain will be able to treat them effectively. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think and that's also the topic of my new book, How We Learn. We should not underestimate the number of constraints that are brought about by the brain architecture. It's not at all an infinitely plastic system. And therefore, we can only recycle part of the circuits, but they bring their own high levels of constraints. So your example is great. You know, what happens to the blind? Do they have a reading system as well? Of course they do. They learn to read in Braille using touch. What has been found in beautiful experiments, in particular by Amir Hamedi, is that they still use the same place in the cortex. I guess we didn't mention yet that we all have the circuit in the same place. Mm-hmm. In sighted readers, it's plus or minus 5 millimeters. It's the same place in the cortex which is being used to learn to read. But it's the same place also in Braille readers. And that's amazing. It means that this part of the cortex is somehow wired for the reading process, even though it cannot evolve for that, right? But it's wired to learn to read even when the shapes are conveyed by touch. And Amir Hamedi in Jerusalem has also found that this is the case if the shapes are conveyed by sound. He created this amazing system where you can paint a shape as a sound going from left to right, and the frequencies from bottom to top are encoded, encode the vertical dimension of the image. So you hear a sound, but progressively you learn that this is a shape. And the blind can use that. When they use it, they activate the appropriate areas in the visual system, even though it's an auditory stimulus, but because the stimulus conveys a shape. So maybe we should think of these areas as recognizing shapes, regardless of the modality in which it is being presented. But your point about the circuits is also quite right. Why is there a very fixed location in the brain for reading? Well, we know now, or we think we know, that it's because of the wiring. This area is pre-wired, and we can see that even in infants, which is really extraordinary now, so probably wired from birth. There is a particular part of the cortex that projects to language areas. It makes sense because we need to be able to name objects. So some of the visual system projects to the language system and allows us to name objects. This is the part that we seem to be using in order to learn to read. So the reading system takes advantage of a circuit which is already there, but for another purpose. That's exactly recycling. You know, there is a circuit that goes from vision to language. We all have it. We found that we could reuse that circuit in order to read, whereas initially it was probably just used for naming objects.
Yeah, very interesting. And since we started talking a little bit about learning to read, I would take that angle and ask you a question in this respect. Of course, the fact that reading is a cultural object, and then we recycle circuits in the brain that were, created during evolution for other purposes, must have implications on what's the most effective way, in a sense, to teach our children how to read, how to deal with the symbols. And another very anecdotal example, but I know it's less anecdotal than it would sound now. It refers again to my daughter. It's very nice how her teachers were insisting a lot on symmetrical letters, just out of experience, essentially, without knowing anything about all the story, right? So when I was talking to them and I was explaining there is a reason for that, they were very surprised. And nonetheless, they knew very, very well that it takes a long time for children to learn that a B is not a D. So they were doing lots of exercises in that respect. So do you think there's any specific indications as to how learning to read should be improved, maybe, as to what we are doing now, related to what we were just discussing?
Well, yes, absolutely. And in fact, also in my new book, How We Learn, more generally, I discuss the fact that there are many connections between cognitive neuroscience and education. And I think there's a whole field there of how to improve education through knowledge, not just of the brain, really, but also of the psychology of learning.
Yeah.
I think the main domain here is psychology. And there is a whole set of bridges from pure neuroscience to the corresponding psychological research on mental representations, to more applied research in the classroom that has actually tested what works, in an educational context, and then large-scale, teaching methods. And so in the case of reading, yes, I think there is very nice convergence. So we know that the circuit in the left hemisphere is mostly connecting the visual system with the spoken language system. And this fits very nicely with this discovery by education research that the best way to teach is through teaching the correspondences between graphemes and phonemes, between letters and sounds. That's how you start. You need to start with the decoding. It's not enough. You need to also have comprehension, but the first thing you need to have is the decoding, so that you turn the signs of letters into sounds, and then you turn the sounds, because you can sort of hear them in your head or even pronounce them overtly. If you know the word, you can understand the spoken word. And progressively, you learn a more direct circuit. You learn to say, well, these letters map onto this meaning. But first, you have to go from the letters to the sound to the meaning. So this is very schematic, but this is the result of a large numbers of experiments in education and in psychological science. And they converge with the neuroscience nicely.
Yeah.
So there's that. There's a lot more. We know that it's very useful to have children trace the letters. So I don't know if the teachers of your daughter do this, but tracing the letters help a lot to break the symmetry, because the gesture is not the same for a P and for a Q, for a B and for a D. It's a different gesture. So it helps to understand that this is a different letter. And so on and so forth. I put together a lot of this evidence in my book on reading, and also the more generic rules of education in this book on how we learn. I think there is both highly specific, domain-specific knowledge, how the wiring is in the reading circuit, but there's also domain general knowledge about how we should learn. And both are important for education.
Yeah. I don't know exactly. I never seen my daughter like kind of pointing or trying to gesturing the letters that she tried to write. But that's one important point that I always make with, again, teachers when they ask me about the value of handwriting, essentially, instead of typing. And I think that is one fundamental point, right? So having to deal with letters is very has a lot to do with having to deal with shapes, and shapes can be experienced in many different modalities, and it's important that the children experience all of those, also because they are self-reinforcing in a way, right? So once you know what's the gesture for P, this will help your visual system also identifying that that's actually a P and not a Q. So that's a very important point for the teachers that are maybe out there.
That's actually a very general point, that memory works better if you have multimodal information and if you go deeper in the processing of information. So if you stick with one modality and maybe a shallow task, like looking whether they are descending letters or ascending letters, this is not good, because it draws attention only to the visual modality and to a very shallow representation of the letters. But if you learn to write at the same time, to do the gestures, if you hear the corresponding sounds, and you attend to the deep properties of the word, then you get a much richer representation of the same stimulus. And we all know that this is better for memory.
Yeah, absolutely. Another point that I think relates to that, before we jump into a little bit of a different domain, is the role of awareness in all of that, right? Because all these cognitive processes that we've been talking about in adults, skilled reader, unfold totally outside of our awareness, right? We don't have to pay attention. We can write and read as we do other things in parallel. So everything unfolds very automatically. And somebody has also suggested that that's the main difference between skilled readers or better readers and more poorer readers, right? Those that have automatized the skills a little bit more, which is a switch that you can very, very clearly see in the children that are learning to read. How much is relevant for the children to be aware of this mechanism? Or maybe it doesn't matter, it doesn't make any difference, it's just a matter of doing this several times so that things get automatized automatically again.
Yeah, this is another great question. It's absolutely true. In adults, we've done all of these experiments with subliminal stimuli, where we flash a word, we hide it behind a mask, so people are not even aware that there is a word, but we could show that the brain activates all of the relevant circuitry, at least for visual word recognition. So this visual word form area and so on, they're all activated by unconscious stimuli. But it's very important to understand that this is not the case in young children. In young children, and generally in all beginning of learning, beginner readers, they all need to make a conscious effort. It's not automatic. And we can see that again with brain imaging, but also with behavior. One very characteristic phenomenon at the beginning of reading is that the length of the word matters a lot. You recognize a short word much faster than a long word, and it's essentially a linear effect. You need more time. Why? Because you need to pay attention to the successive letters or successive syllables or successive units. That's not the case in a skilled reader. It's actually quite amazing. You and I, because we are expert readers, we can recognize words of 3 letters just as fast as words of 9 letters. It's a flat curve. But that's the effect of expertise. What we see in young children is a linear effect. And what we see in young children is more and more effort, conscious effort, which we can see associated with parietal and prefrontal areas of the brain. These are circuits that are involved at the beginning of learning and that disappear when you become expert, as you automatize. And in my book, How We Learn, I try to emphasize this as a general feature of learning. We always start with effortful, attention-dependent, conscious learning. This is necessary because conscious attention amplifies the information. So it's an essential target for teachers actually to direct attention to the proper level in children. But it takes an effort. And progressively, with automatization, that circuit will disappear. We will no longer need to pay conscious effort. And both are super important to understand by teachers. The orienting of attention, but also the need for automatization. If you don't automatize, then you are always using all of these resources of your global conscious workspace, and these resources cannot be used for something else. So a child who sticks with this, early strategy of letter by letter reading cannot concentrate on the meaning of the message. Cannot do, for instance, mathematics if the question which is written is about mathematics. It's very difficult to do 2 things at the same time, almost impossible to do 2 things at the same time if they are conscious. So automatization is an absolutely key feature, but we always start with conscious effort and then we automatize.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so let's jump on to another very, very interesting aspect of this field of research before we maybe move to the last sort of part of this interview on something a little bit more applied to actual experience with reading that we have every day. Lots of what we talked about is related to, is in a way not specific to language, right? We talk about recycling of visual circuits that were created by evolution for other purposes, and most of other purposes are shared with other species. So this would maybe imply that we are not the only species that can learn to read, said provocatively, because of course, I mean, phonology, the ability to sound out letters and the ability to associate meaning to letters to a little bit of less extent is very difficult to observe in animal. But in terms of visual word identification, I guess that from the depiction of reading that we have sort of traced today could be possible, right? Is there any attested case of course, not in nature, but maybe in some experimental setup that you can have non-human animals to play around with letters and words somehow to the same extent that we do?
Yes, of course. It's exactly the idea that we had 2 years ago. I was at the Gordon conference and I was hearing beautiful work by Jim DiCarlo, by Doris Tsao, who are studying the visual system of non-human primates, macaque monkeys. And it's not very different from ours, and I think the 2 systems are very similar. And suddenly we got this idea, what if a primate was exposed to letters, was exposed to letter strings? Would we find that the circuit is already, in a certain sense, ready for reading acquisition? That's also the idea of neuronal recycling. Maybe we should emphasize this a bit more, but the shapes of letters have been selected because they fit that circuit. If they didn't, we could not learn to read, according to the recycling idea. This system is not infinitely plastic, so we present to it cultural shapes that are fit for reading acquisition by this particular circuit. Right? So we got this idea, what if macaque monkeys were exposed to letters? And we were encouraged by a prior experiment by Jonathan Granger and colleagues, Joël Fagot. In the south of France, they have a baboon facility, and they train baboons just behaviorally with words, with written words. And amazingly, they could show that the baboons progressively would learn to label with, two buttons, whether what they see is an English word or is not an English word. And incredibly, you could show them new English words that they have never seen before, and they would say, yes, it's an English word. So, or no, it's a non-word. So they would generalize. The magic, of course, is not real. They don't really understand what's an English word. They have no, as you said, phonology. They have no semantics of the word. There is no meaning. But what they do is they have statistics of words. They're able to see that if, for instance, a word ends with ing, it's likely to be an English word, and so on and so forth. So their work showed that baboons were able to do statistics. And we started from this work in a recent paper in Nature Communications. It was published a few months ago with Jim DiCarlo. We did the same thing while monkeys were being recorded with little chips in their ventral visual system, so-called Utah arrays that allow to record from hundreds of neurons at the same time. And what we saw was extraordinary is these are completely untrained monkeys. They see strings of letters for the first time, but their brains already has neurons that are sufficiently well tuned to these letters. Surely, if they were trained, this would become even better tuning, as we see in humans. But in a sense, the circuit is already ready for letter acquisition. And we showed that you could take these neurons and decode, to some extent, what was the word, whether it contained the letter A or not, for instance. And you actually find neurons that prefer the letter A to other letters. It's no magic, it's part of the repertoire of these neurons in the ventral visual cortex, even before any training, to have biases for a certain letter compared to another, or a certain set of letters. And we capitalize on that in reading acquisition. So it was yet another proof of this recycling idea. And we could even see that there are neurons that care about pairs of letters, apparently. So maybe a letter A on the left and a letter R on the right, something like that, that would help you to recognize a particular word. It's very important to understand that the brain is not a blank slate. I think this is the conclusion from all this discussion. There is no such thing as a blank slate. There's a lot of organization in the brain, and even an untrained monkey has a large-scale repertoire, partially random circuits, but partially organized one. And we start from this level in the human brain. There's also an aspect I insist a lot in how we learn, is the baby is already a highly organized organism. We shouldn't think of it as disorganized human. It's not the case. It's a highly organized system that asks, projects, creates a hypothesis about the external world, and in many cases acts as a scientist, selects the hypotheses that fit with the external world. And that's what we began to see in the monkey. Now we have to continue these experiments. Jim DiCarlo's team is actually training the monkeys to become better at recognizing words, and we'll see how this circuit will change. It's a very exciting research.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We're also doing something a little bit related to that here in CISA with my colleague Davide Zoccolan, who's also a visual neuroscientist working with rats in this case. Of course, the species is completely different from macaque monkeys, but as we were saying, the visual system has remained relatively stable in the course of evolution, at least for what concerns these very fundamental properties, like being able of collecting the statistics, the regularities that are around in the world, and of which our world is extremely rich. One very nice result that we have recently obtained, and we are writing up right now, is this thing that we started to teach the rats individual letters. And of course, this is an extremely trivial task for them, because an individual letters is just a visual symbol, like any other symbol that they process. And then we try to see whether they sort of spontaneously generalize the kind of knowledge that we apply to these letters when we learn it. For example, we see that the letter is the same in different words, and we see the similarity between these words related to these letters. Like a very nice case and a very intuitive one is anagrams, right? The two words tea and eat in English, they sound completely different, they mean completely different things, but everyone can appreciate that they're visually relatively similar because they're made up of the same letters. And what we found, it was very surprisingly, or maybe not very surprisingly after you think about it, is that they had this spontaneous generalization. So once they've learned the letter A, if they saw two pairs of letters like AB and B and A, they understood that the two strings were kind of more similar to each other versus any other random letter combination. So this again goes in the same direction, right? That the system, obviously these rats cannot read. Obviously they have no phonology. Obviously they have no meaning for that, although some meaning I think it could be thought. But still sort of naturally understand that you can create, if you want, larger objects like words based on smaller objects like letters. And then the relationship between this lower level and higher level objects is organized in a way that is not so dissimilar from the way that letters are organized into words in the end.
Yes, but your experiment also raises an interesting question, which is about syntax or the spatial organization of it. It's very important for a reader to distinguish, let's say, the word on and the word no. They are just different words.
Sure.
So it's not enough to have completely invariant representations of the letters. It's very important to understand the relative locations of the letters. So we are working on this at the moment. And there is a recent research that suggests that, in fact, the letter detectors are actually specific to a particular location or rough location. And so if you assemble them together, and that's what we found in the monkey as well, there is both invariant representation of the letter, but enough location-specific information that you can tell whether it's no or whether it's on. This is still an open question, and at the higher level, how we organize the syntax of language, it's a huge question. There's something very particular in the human brain that allows us to pay attention to the relationships between words.
Yeah.
It's not just a bunch of words, and perhaps this is a key difference with the monkey. The monkey doesn't seem to have strong syntax. At the level of multi-word phrases, there's zero evidence that even chimpanzees or apes of any kind actually process syntax. So I propose in recent experiment that this is perhaps the key difference with the human brain. The human brain has acquired a syntactic ability.
Yeah, this is very interesting and definitely matches lots of research, especially we have mentioned the statistical learning abilities that the brain has. So there's a sensitivity to the regularity that happens out there in the world. And there's lots of evidence that lots of very complex constructs like word identification that we have studied in cognition for many, many years can be somehow, I wouldn't say maybe reduced, but at least simulated, just based on very simple algorithms that are sensitive to these statistical regularities. That is definitely less the case for syntax. I'm not aware of any purely statistical learning system as like the visual system of a macaque could be, is able to get even close to the syntax in the language that we now have, which is definitely at a different level of complexity and flexibility, maybe even more.
This is an argument that I also develop in How We Learn.
Yeah.
I agree that there's been remarkable progress in neural networks recently, but when it comes to the symbolic or linguistic abilities of humans, they are not great. And in fact, there are, even though people get very excited about GPT-3 and other similar networks recently that have really remarkable statistical learning performance, but they're not good at syntax. And they fail in very elementary tests of, for instance, having an agreement between a noun and a verb, even though they are remote in the sentence, and maybe there are intermediate nouns in between. They are not mimicking very well what happens in young infants. I developed the argument that infants are way superior to existing neural networks. Infants are the supercomputers. Infants acquire language with remarkably small numbers of inputs. It's not like millions of training utterances like Wikipedia. Fortunately, infants will acquire the language with just quite reduced input. Not zero input, of course, but quite reduced. And it's not just language, it's also mathematics and science. There is no neural network currently which has this ability that we have to compress the information in a symbolic form like we do in science or in proto-science. All humans understand the organization of the external world in a way which is much deeper than non-human primates and than existing neural networks. So my argument is that there are basic properties of the human brain that remain to be found. It's difficult because they have to be studied in the human brain. If I am right, they are unique to the human brain. Something happened in hominization. There is a singularity. There's the crossing of a threshold. And this very particular property of syntax, which I think is a very good candidate for what happened during this threshold.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Okay, I think we are left with more or less 5 minutes, so we don't have much time left. But there is one thing that, again, you focus quite a lot on your most recent book, How We Learn, which is this idea of, I will use the technical word first, called consolidation, which essentially refers to the idea that learning happens somehow like in 2 stages. One that is more explicit, where you still have a sort of in a way, an episodic memory of something that you have to learn, like when we study on a book for an exam, for example. But then the real learning, in a sense, happens when you get to the second stage, where this information is transferred to a different place in the brain and becomes, if you want, part of the background information. So that kind of information that deploys essentially in a completely automatic, unconscious way. It is very interesting for many, many reasons. One of the reasons which I think is very interesting about is that because there's research suggesting that consolidation has something to do with sleep. So we consolidate a lot as we have naps in the afternoon, as we go to sleep at night. So many people have attempted to sort of popularize this very complex neuroscience body of work into the idea that if you want to learn better, you should read before you go to bed. Is that true, or what's your view on that?
Yeah, well, there is remarkable evidence, as you said, which I tell in the last chapter of this book. It's very interesting that it starts with psychology. I think this is a very general case, actually. We almost always start with behavior, and then we discover how it works in the brain. So the first finding is actually quite old, and it is that memory is better after you've slept, and or performance is better. There is beautiful experiments where you do a very simple sensory motor test, like a video game, and you play and you play and you play, and you reach a sort of asymptotic level of performance during the day. And if you continue to play, you don't improve very much. You go to sleep, and the next morning, without any practice, you are better. You perform better. And this has been found also in the Ebbinghaus memory forgetting curves. There is forgetting, but during the night, there is no longer forgetting. Okay. So what is happening? Psychologists say, well, something must be happening during the night. We're not just, resting. And this fitted very well with discoveries in neuroscience. First of all, it's a very old finding that the EEG, the electroencephalogram, is of course not flat during sleep. It's extremely active. The brain is enormously active during sleep. And then came these discoveries in rats that if you record from neurons during sleep, you can see that in certain moments, they will fire with an extremely organized pattern that reproduces what happened during the day. What happened during the previous day is somehow replayed. And this is the term that the neuroscientists have been using. It's replay during the night of what happened during the day. Now, there are several exciting properties. One is that you can decode what's being replayed. It's so precise that, for instance, if you are in the hippocampus in an area that cares about where the animal is, you can tell that the animal is sort of dreaming or replaying a particular trajectory in space. And you can say, well, the animal thinks, in a certain sense, that it is in this corner of the maze, and now it's moved to this other corner. You can tell the trajectory from the neurons. So it is an actual representation. It's not random noise at all. It's actually a replay of a very particular representation. And the second exciting thing is that it's faster than light. It may take the rat maybe 10 seconds to go through the maze, but in the replay, it can be 20 times faster. It's amazing. So it's like this, very fast sequence. And because it's fast, there are several advantages. You can do it many times. So maybe this is a way that the brain has to have many more instances. It's a problem for these neural networks to have enough training, Maybe this is a way that the brain has found to have more training because it has many more instances of maybe something that happened only once during the previous day can be replayed 100 times during the night. And it's also a way to put the events closer together so that the learning can connect them together. And we go back to psychology. There is lovely experiments showing that we abstract away. We don't just store what happened during the previous day. During the night, the brain manages to extract more abstract information, maybe because it connects the elements that are closer together in time. So we go back to human experiments, our beautiful experiments, even in children, showing that we do store knowledge during the night in a better form. It's more available the next morning. It's more abstract in the next morning. There is a beautiful Nature paper showing that we make mathematical discoveries during the night. We can discover the proof of a certain shortcut in a theorem during the night. And of course, scientists have reported that many times. You make discoveries during the night. You wake up with a new idea in the morning that actually works in many cases. So it's an essential property of the brain. There's a lot of learning going on in the school during the day, but we need to attend to the part which is going on in the night. And if we close on that, I think this is a huge message for the schools and for the parents. Pay attention to your children's sleep. We should all pay attention to our sleep. What we learn during the day must be consolidated, otherwise it will go away. So we need to sleep. You mentioned naps. Naps actually work. There is the same effect during naps, smaller effect, but real effect. So we should all learn to use our sleep to be better learners. That's a general message of my book, of course. There are many things that we should know about our brains. It's very much know ourselves, in knowing ourselves, gnotis eoton, the ideal of the Greek philosophers, know thyself. We can know ourselves better through neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. What we learn about learning can help us learn better.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. And I just want to reinforce the message that Professor Dehaene just sort of sent us, because I think that his most recent book, How We Learn, is really doing that very effectively. He's bringing the neuroscience to real life in a way that you don't need at all to be a neuroscientist to understand the core messages, like more or less what we've discussed now. Okay, so thanks again. I think we ran out of time. Thank you again, Sten, and for the audience, this is Professor Dehaene again, who released his book recently, How We Learn, Why Brains Learn Better Than Machines. And the book is available already. I'm not sure whether you're planning a translation in Italian. Probably there will be one.
It's coming out. Absolutely, it's coming out. But for the moment, it's here. It's in English. Yeah. But it will be out in, I think, a few months.
Yeah, fantastic. So you will have lots of nice time reading Professor Dehaene words and rethinking maybe perhaps a bit back at what we discussed today. So thanks again.
Thanks a lot for your great questions.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to you again. Bye-bye, everyone.
Ciao.